Hi, welcome to Myers ASMR. Today is story time. So let's pick up with jazz, an introduction to the history and legends behind America's music by Bob Blumenthal. First, I have to take a sip of my herbal tea. This one is peppermint. So good. I needed that. All right, let's see where we left off. To best capture these interweaving themes, and because jazz evolution over the course of its history suggests that we score its development in scores of years, this book examines jazz in 2-decade intervals. This approach is preferable to laying the basics out, one instrument or one style at a time, while also giving emphasis to the various comet-like or extended careers of the major musicians that an alphabetized series of personal biographies can obscure. Jazz has not been a relay race where one player or stylistic school rushes forward, only to halt after handing the evolutionary baton to the next generation. It is more accurate to view jazz as a tree, with established stylistic branches continuing to proliferate even as new offshoots emerge and flourish. Neither has jazz been driven by a constant trajectory of progress. It has seen peaks and valleys, surged and stayed in place, even looked backward to reclaim missed opportunities. Jazz has also been inextricably tied to developments in technology, which have formed the historical archive by which we continue to reevaluate and revise the jazz story. Any number of musicians will argue that they, or those they revere, were never captured whole in recordings. Yet recordings make it possible for us to continue to marvel at the genius of Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and Miles Davis, and so many more. But what if Fats Waller was correct, and the need to inquire about jazz signals a basic lack of empathy? What if, as the cliche has it, you really do have to dig it to dig it? The alto saxophonist Julian Cannonball Adderley may have been onto something when he remarked that being hip is a fact of life rather than a state of mind, since an analytical appreciation of jazz in the absence of a visceral response would be an incomplete appreciation indeed. Yet, for many who find jazz intimidating, the problem may be more one of what you think you know, or perhaps what you think you don't know. Great jazz, like great literature, can operate on more than one level. To return to another term with multiple meanings, the more you dig or know, the more you can dig or appreciate. So, even if jazz has yet to become a fact of your life, please read on. Chapter 1, Blues and Roots, Jazz Before 1920. The spread of jazz in the first 2 decades of the 20th century is astounding given the technological limits of the time. On the basis of a few phonograph recordings, some piano rolls, and the wanderlust of early jazz musicians, a style of music that was spawned primarily in black communities of the American South has spread across the country and begun to make inroads around the world. Jazz was already starting to signify freedom and forward thinking, and it would soon lend its name to a euphoric period that saw other musical styles redefined by its feeling and beat. Roots and routes. There were no audio recordings of jazz before 1917, so we have to turn to other forms of evidence to discover how jazz took shape before 1920. what we could call the music's prehistoric period. Even after the startling success of the original Dixieland jazz bands Livery Stable Blues and Dixieland One Step, the first Jazz 78 RPM recording and a million seller upon its release in 1917, recording companies remain more interested in classical artists and more polite dance orchestras. The rolls of paper cut by seminal figures like Scott Joplin and Jelly Roll Morton for use in player pianos also provide only limited insight. They fail to capture nuances of touch and accent. Also, in a precursor to the overdubbing of later decades, piano rolls often contain added parts that made the resulting music almost impossible to play by a single pianist. Morton and Joseph King Oliver began to record in 1923, but jazz developed at such a rapid pace in this period that the music did not necessarily reflect what these and other artists sounded like 10 or 20 years earlier. Many witnesses who lived in New Orleans and were familiar with the music played there during the 1897 to 1917 heyday of the city's infamous Storyville district insisted that the first recordings by Oliver's Creole band represent a significant evolution from his earlier style. Some even swore that the real sounds of Storyville were never captured on recordings. In the soundbite version of jazz's origins, rhythmic African music and harmonic European composition merge in the black and Creole neighborhoods of New Orleans, taking root there and then migrating north and east by riverboat just prior to the 1920s. But this capsule creation myth glosses over a far more complex and widespread history. When Morton, Oliver, and their peers began to develop what the world came to know as jazz, they were able to draw upon nearly a century of African-influenced musical styles developed all over America and the Caribbean. And many of these innovators didn't wait for the shutdown of New Orleans' red light district or the next paddle wheeler leaving from the local port to take what they had learned on the road. Africa. Africa was an essential source point for jazz music, inspiring such key jazz elements as rhythmic expression, improvisation, call and response, and narrative techniques, and interactive spirituality. In Africa, unlike Europe, rhythm served as the primary element of musical expression, and ensembles composed entirely of percussion instruments created extended polyrhythmic works. African music was not committed to paper. It was an oral, or more accurately, an oral tradition, learned by ear and therefore more naturally subject to spontaneous variation. Techniques such as call and response patterns, where a lead voice is answered by the surrounding ensemble, and narrative forms such as the insult-laden songs of allusion from West Africa would reappear as central components of the jazz style. Religious music. The power of African musical ideas was felt in the Western Hemisphere long before 1900 and far beyond the confines of a single community. Africa influenced evolving styles of religious music, at first through the survival of voodoo societies in Catholic portions of the New World, where European religious practices were less likely to be imposed upon the slaves than in the Protestant American South. This gave African religious music a foothold in New Orleans, where the slaves were allowed to dance and play instruments in Congo Square beginning in 1817, as well as in Cuba and Haiti. Traces of African influence were also entering Christian religious practice. Camp meetings and revivals popular in rural and frontier America during much of the 19th century frequently featured black preachers who sermonized in a florid, interactive style that was at times similar to the trance-like states of the Vodun societies that anticipated the congregational fervor of later gospel services. A more formal merger of African and European musical influences led to circle dances, or ring shouts, which were first described in the Civil War period. In these musical expressions, improvised variations on short, rhythmic melodies, later called blue notes, were created through call and response patterns. Concert performances of Negro spirituals, which became popular after the first tour of the Fisk Jubilee Singers in 1871, are another example of the African European synthesis. Minstrel shows. American secular music was also showing the influence of Africa in a variety of ways. During the last half of the 19th century, minstrel shows were the most popular form of entertainment throughout the country. They presented a caricature of Negro life that lingered until the civil rights era of the 1960s. Minstrel shows mixed dramatic vignettes and vaudeville acts performed by Caucasians in blackface, like the popular Thomas D. Daddy Jim Crow Rice. They featured stylizations of black music by white composers like Stephen Foster. The shows were a two-edged sword, stereotyping and stigmatizing the manners of the former slaves while also spreading their culture and subtly mocking the mainstream. Well, that completes the story time for today. Thanks for listening and watching. Like and subscribe. Catch me in the next video. May you find lasting happiness. Bye.